Would like to introduce our final speaker for this year's Florida Research Administrators Conference, and that is my colleague, Doug Backman. Doug is the Director of Research Operations and Compliance in the Office of Research at the University of Central Florida. Mr. Backman has over 31 years of sponsored program experience in higher education administration. Mr. Backman is responsible for research operations and compliance programs to include audit mitigation and investigations, financial research administration, contract and grant administration requirements, human protections administration, and UCF's conflict of interest and research integrity programs. Doug is also responsible for the UCF Export Control Office and the Facility Security Program. Doug has been UCF's administrative representative to the Federal Demonstration Partnership since 2005 and serves as a member and is a member of the Conflict of Interest Subcommittee and the Uniform Guidance Procurement Working Group. Doug has been a member of the National Council of University Research Administrators for 20 years and has served as a presenter at Incura, SRAI, Autumn, and other higher education industry organizations. Doug serves as a faculty member for UCF's Master of Research Administration program. He holds a Master of Science degree in Contract and Acquisition Management from the Florida Institute of Technology and is a certified professional contracts manager from the National Contract Management Association. Doug is also a perennial FRAC presenter. Every time we've had FRAC, we've had the pleasure of having knowledge shared with us from Doug. Doug is one of those people that if, oh, this is a really hard problem, I'd better go ask Doug. I can't tell you how many times that has happened. And I want to thank him from the bottom of my heart for being here today, once again, to share his expertise with us. Let's please welcome Doug Backman.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's very kind. I really do appreciate it. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So today we're going to talk about just some interesting facts about research misconduct. We're going to go into some of the more important areas of research misconduct. I'm going to go into some terms that you may have not heard, you may have heard. We're going to dive into it. If you have any questions, you can ask, and I'll depend on Jennifer to tell me what those questions will be. And then I have a couple of cases where I can explain. These are cases that happened at UCF. We can go into some of those. I'm going to hopefully not talk too fast. I don't think this will take an hour. It may take that amount of time, but we'll go from there. So just some interesting things for everyone to realize is that 1% of scientists surveyed admitted to fabricating or falsifying their own data at least once in their career. I think that's absolutely fascinating that would happen, because if you have 1% who are claiming that, it's probably larger because there's a lot who aren't claiming it. 34% admitted to less serious misdemeanors, which would include poor research design, poor data management, deliberately excluding scientists from the authorship list of scientific publications. That's a big one. And the misuse of research funds. 14% of the scientists surveyed reported their colleagues had fabricated data, and up to 72% were said to have participated in less serious misdemeanors, as I've described above. Oh, let's see here. Am I getting? Oh, not getting. There we go. So, what is research misconduct? So let's first start with fabrication. It's making up data or results and recording or reporting them. Falsification is manipulating research materials, equipment, or processes, or changing or omitting data or results such that the research is not accurately represented by the research record. And plagiarism is the appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit. Majority of the cases that I have fall into the plagiarism arena. The fabrication and falsification actually happen, but and they are usually the most complex of cases, but plagiarism is usually the most common. And something to keep in mind is that research misconduct does not include honest error or differences of opinion. I have to point that out in many cases because you will get authorship disputes, which either may be an honest error, it may be a difference of opinion, who's actually the author. But when it gets down to the nitty-gritty, it's not plagiarism, and it normally is not falsification or fabrication. Okay. I'm having problems with this. Okay. So another thing to remember and to understand about research misconduct requirements is that it has to represent a significant departure from accepted practices of the relevant research community. So if it's something that is commonly done, whether it be the way that something is written, the way that text is cited, as an example, then and is normal for that scientific arena, then it is not going to be a significant departure from accepted practices. And of course, you have to look at the field of science. It could be in aerodynamics. There's common features, common topics that is not a significant departure, and that may be true for other areas such as optics and aerospace, just on and on. So the misconduct must also be committed intentionally or knowingly and recklessly. And those three items are very important. They're delineated in the regulations, and the National Science Foundation is specific about these three words and what the respondent actually did. So the allegation must be proven by preponderance of the evidence. And what does that really mean? Because many people can say things, but we have to make sure that they're being accurate. And preponderance of the evidence means proof by information that, compared with opposing it, leads to the conclusion that the fact at issue is more probably true than not. So you can tell that in some cases, the fact of something being claimed by a claimant might be subjective and would need to be reviewed by a committee of peers. And we'll get into how those committees work, but these are things that are important, and we'll keep moving forward based on this principle. So what is really the difference between intentionally, knowingly, and recklessly? And why is this so important to federal agencies when it comes to administrative adjudication? So intentionally, or with the intent, means that the defendant, or the respondent in this case, goal was to cause the end result or engage in that conduct. And so when committee members have to make that determination, whether that's a true statement, or knowingly means that a defendant is aware of their conduct, but it does not require that the defendant know the conduct is unlawful. So it may mean that they make an error, they may make a citation error, they may make a reference error, but they didn't know that it's not proper. Now, many people in higher education, especially at the graduate level and beyond, would think that would be a little laughable. But when you take into consideration the large number of different international communities and their publication requirements, rules of engagement, it's not unusual for people to not really understand exactly what the United States version of plagiarism is, just as an example. And then finally, recklessly means a person is aware of a substantial risk, but consciously disregards it. So recklessly normally is someone who is pretty much aware of what's happening, but they don't care. They're still going to move forward. And that does happen with the fabrication and falsification cases, because I mean, that's an obvious statement. Not so much with plagiarism, but I have seen it where it is reckless. So let's dig in just a little bit on the standard of proof, the preponderance of the evidence. Let's talk about this because it's important that the committee members understand what they're being tasked to do and what they're being asked to look at. So the burden of proof, the institution now has the burden of proof for making a finding of research misconduct. That's the institution. And the respondent, that who's being accused, has the burden of providing by a preponderance of the evidence any and all affirmative defenses raised. And what that means is that when these allegations come in, they have to be honest. The allegation itself from the claimant, it can't be flippant, I'll use that term, but the respondent has a responsibility to affirm and provide a defense as to what he or she has done or not done. So also the respondent has the burden of providing by a preponderance of the evidence any mitigating factors that are relevant to a decision. And when a decision is made, they get an opportunity to provide additional information to review what the committee's done. And we'll get into that to a certain degree as we move forward. But for the respondent, the burden of proof is on them. And please remember that, because that's important on these cases. What about the claimant? What do they have to do? Well, the allegation must be made in good faith. And good faith is a legal term. And it means, again, I'll just use for lack of a better term, it can't be unreasonable. It can't be with proper backup documentation or proper proof that something actually occurred. In many cases, we do get in our, what I'll call our 1-800 telephone lines that want to make an allegation. They'll make just a general allegation, and we have no way of knowing whether it's in good faith. And we have to go back to the claimant to substantiate what they're asking, and we do. We would be on a wild goose chase in many of these cases, because many claimants do not want to reveal who they are, what they are, why they are. They just want to get something out. Sometimes it's accusatory without reason, without purpose. And that's part of the process of a research misconduct office is to make that determination. So what also other institutional responsibilities are there? The institutions have to come up with written policies and procedures. That's not only for the university at hand, faculty, researchers, but also from a federal perspective and the assurance that is required when you receive federal money, that you have proper guidelines that meet the federal research misconduct requirements. So there's a formal process to respond to research misconduct allegations. Most universities, higher education institutions, hospitals, they have this process. A certain person, a certain office that receives these and processes them. There also has to be a foster an environment that promotes responsible conduct of research and research training. And that would include requirements by the National Science Foundation, the NIH, but also responsibilities on faculty on a regular basis, whether it be face-to-face or online training, and continue review and monitoring of activity going on. Also, to protect the position and reputation of the respondent and the complainant, witnesses, and committee members. This is a hard thing to do because in many cases, a respondent will become defensive or the claimant will become much more verbiage and verbal than what they should be. And many people will know what's going on, whether it be in the institute, in the department. And it gets to be very difficult, but it is the institution's responsibility to protect the positions and their reputation, because in many cases, as you know, there's many people who will find people guilty because they hear of it, even if it's untrue. We do everything we can to protect both the respondent, especially, and the claimant in all cases. And that's why I have down here provide confidentiality to the respondent and complainant. And again, I'll reemphasize the institutional assurance with the Office of Research Integrity. That's something that every institution has to have if it's going to accept knowledge. So I will just make some comments about a little bit about the process. There is a deciding official who makes a final determination, both in the inquiry and the investigation process. I'll go into that. Most institutions have what's called a research integrity officer. I happen to be that person, as well as the director of compliance. So how does this work, really? When I get a allegation, I have to conduct an assessment, and it's a preliminary review of the allegation, and it determines if an inquiry is required, and the allegation must be based on good faith basis. So again, you know, the good faith basis means the allegation is based on reasonable facts to support the claim. It's not frivolous. I have had cases from the Office of Research Integrity, as well as NIH directly, who have asked me to do an assessment, and I find it to be frivolous. I find it not to be reasonable facts. But it takes quite a bit of time to prove that. I have to go in and talk to the respondent. I have to look at the publication proposal, could be award documentation to make that point. Sometimes it takes even longer than an inquiry would, but it's important because the respondent reputation, their career is at stake. But you do have to go through that process. So if it's determined that through the assessment that there is reasonable determination that the facts bear the allegation to be true, then there needs to be an inquiry. So the allegation has to fall within the federal research misconduct definition. That gets back to fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. It's, you know, the allegation is credible and specific so that the potential evidence of research misconduct can be identified. And obviously there's the confidentiality. An inquiry committee of the respondent's peers is identified. There's conflict of interest requirements that you have to go through to make sure that people who are on the committee do not have a conflict of interest with the respondent and or the claimant. So there's a number of rules of engagement, I'll call, that's in the regulation and in the universities, or should I say the institution's assurance. Now, if the inquiry committee comes to the decision that an investigation is warranted, then what has to take place is a new committee is formed, and it's called the investigation committee. There's rules to require the respondent to be notified. There's a custody of records and evidence that have to be collected. This is also true in the inquiry stage, but for the sake of time, I'm only going to outline it here in the investigation. You have to document the investigation records, facts, and evidence. And I'll make a comment, sometimes that's not easy because you have to go to the respondent and gather documents. Sometimes the respondents are cooperative, sometimes they're not. If they're uncooperative, that's obviously going to go against, in the case itself, as to what we're supposed to be collecting and why. There's also certain people that need to be interviewed, and may I make a comment that not everybody wants to be interviewed. There's usually favoritism towards certain respondent or claimants, and you have to have an actual interview process that has to be transcribed accordingly or recorded. Normally these things are recorded, especially in the times of remoteness. We usually go through that process. So there has to be a specific statement of findings, and this usually gets down to the actual item that's being plagiarized, document that's being fabricated, falsified, whatever the case may be. But the statement of findings have to be clear. And if you were the one being accused, you'd want them to be clear, and you want to understand what it is that you need to defend yourself for. So there's usually identification of the responsible parties, which is usually the respondent and the claimant. There may be other parties or other what I'll call co-claimants. There could also be co-respondents. So at the end of it, there's usually a draft of the investigation report. You have to give an opportunity for the respondent to make comments to that report. There's inclusive of the research integrity officer's assessment of the facts. And then there normally is in a final investigation report, the findings are outlined, the recommendations are made, and the deciding official makes their determination as to whether they agree with the committee. So again, they can either accept the final investigation report as written. They can determine if the committee recommendations are acceptable based on the findings. They can make a determination that is different from the committee's findings. But this must be based on facts with a detailed explanation. They can return the report to the committee with requests for further fact-finding or analysis. And that last bullet there is usually what happens. If the deciding official is uncomfortable with the outcome of the investigation, and this may also be in an inquiry, and they want the committee to go back and to either A, look at additional information because it's not clear, B, ask the research integrity officer to look for subject matter experts with either in the institution or entity or outside of it to gather additional information to either prove the facts at hand or to give the respondent additional information to defend themselves. So obviously I've got to notify the research integrity officer has to notify the federal sponsor. Private is a different issue. We normally don't go to private entities and express what's out there until a final decision is made, if at all. And so we do, obviously I've got to notify the deciding official of all these things. And there usually is institutional administrative actions that need to be taken. I will say that normally the National Science Foundation is very interested in administrative actions. They have a reporting schema that identifies what these actions are. They have a tendency to delineate them in a very, very basic way, but they're very adamant about what, how, why, and where as it comes to the actions that the university decided to take against a respondent or not. So let's just take a little bit closer look at fabrication so you can get an idea of what's really being asked. Is the intentional misrepresentation of research results by making up data, such as that reported in a journal article, or as with other forms of scientific misconduct. It is the intent to deceive that marks fabrication as highly unethical and different from scientists deceiving themselves. So there are people who are biased, I'll use that term, but in most cases, when we're looking at fabrication, they're creating data. And, I'm using this Wikipedia definition, but fabrication may be illegal. Now, I'll give you one example of fabrication. Many of you have heard of different examples. I have students who are being asked to go out into the field, and they will actually create data that didn't exist in the field, whether it be for biological studies, whether it be for interviews with human subjects, whatever it would be. And the reason that they make it up is because they don't want to go out and work. They want to get paid, and they don't want to actually document the data. So it may be that the faculty member is unaware that this has happened until perhaps an allegation is made. That's just one area of misrepresentation and fabrication. There's much more egregious examples by faculty where they have, in fact, created and fabricated documentation, spent more time in doing that than actually conducting the research. And it is known, it gets into journals. The federal agencies do not like it because you're using their federal dollars to conduct science that is, in essence, fabrication. So some additional examples is outright synthesis of experimental data, reporting experiments that were never conducted, as I mentioned, fudging, or what they call massaging, or outright manufacture of experimental data. There's also some forms of unintentional academic incompetence or malpractice that can be difficult to distinguish from intentional fabrication, and it usually takes subject matter experts to do that. Although in some cases, when you find these types of things in a journal, authors are, journal authors and different subject matter experts are more than willing to come forward with areas of contesting what's being delineated in journal. I'll also add the failure to account for measurement error, the failure to adequately control experiments for any parameters being measured. I'll also make a comment that in some of the online forums, there's quite a bit of allegations made against faculty without real backup documentation, other than their word that things were manufactured, things were photoshopped, things were created in the actual publication, but there's really not proof. There's really no additional backup documentation. The claimants, in many cases, even when they put it on the internet forum, are creating a claim, but the backup documentation is not there. And unfortunately for the investigator or the researcher, the problem with it is that they have no way of defending themselves. They can come out and make statements. In some cases, the blogs or the online forums don't even allow that to happen. I've run into that several times now over the past couple of years, and it's really unfortunate for the faculty member. So if you look at some of the fabrication findings, ORI, as an example, has found respondent engaged in research misconduct by recording dates and providing their own blood samples to cause these samples to be falsely labeled as samples from 98 study subjects in a cancer genetics study involving human blood samples. And the reason I bring this out is that people actually do this. I mean, they're actually fabricating information. In another case, ORI found by a preponderance of the evidence that respondent intentionally and knowingly or recklessly engaged in research misconduct by falsifying and or fabricating X-ray crystallographic data for 11 protein structures and falsely reporting them as experimentally derived from X-ray diffraction experiments in 9 publications and in 12 deposits in the protein data bank, the PDB. So ORI found that the respondent intentionally, knowingly, and when they say or recklessly, since they did it, and recklessly falsified and fabricated the PDB coordinate files deposited for all the 11 structures. I just make a comment here that some cases, committee members may only find that they intentionally did it. Usually, if they did intentionally do it, they may have done it knowingly. Usually, recklessly is far out there, and they don't identify people as reckless. This is obviously in the second bullet here, this second example. It is reckless to do something like that, but it happens, and I think you'd be surprised how regularly it happens on a national scale. I guess I should say international scale. So falsification examples, changing or omission of research results to support claims, a hypothesis or any other data. Manipulation of research instrumentation, materials or processes, and manipulation of images or representations in a manner that distorts the data or reads too much between the lines. Now, I will make a comment, and one of my case studies I'm going to give an example on is that usually in publications, especially in the bio field, there are parameters of how much you can, I'll use the term Photoshop, I mean that positively to enhance and to make sure that the reader understands where enzyme color diffraction has occurred as an example. And there are parameters for that. And in many cases, claims will come in that those parameters have been breached, but the truth of it is they probably had not. So it's not an easy topic when you go into these types of issues, but the falsification examples that are given here are usually egregious, and ORI finds them to be obvious, and they make it known when they go through their own research, misconduct, inquiry or investigation, or ask the university or the entity to conduct it. And I'll just make this comment right now as I'm thinking about it, that most of the time, for example, NSF will come down and identify misconduct, and they'll ask whether or not the university wants to participate in the review of it, i.e. assessment, inquiry, investigation, or if they want NSF to do it. We never want NSF to do it, as an example, but we normally take that all on ourselves, and we have to report back to them on a regular basis. So what are some of the findings with falsification? They found respondent engaged in research misconduct by falsifying data that were included in a manuscript and a revision submitted to the cancer research entitled IDO1 and Kerman pathway. Or I also found that the respondent engaged in research misconduct by intentional, knowing, or reckless falsification or fabrication of the research record by selectively reporting by inappropriate inclusion or omission or alteration of data points in 10 figures and falsely reporting the statistical significance based on falsified data in 10 figures across 2 papers in supplementary material. So data integrity is a key here, and data integrity is a key factor in fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. And it's found quite regularly, either in the creation of proposals and or journals. And it's reviewed by NSF and NIH when the journal is making a claim that the federal monies were used as the research results were published in that journal. Another one is where the respondent falsely reused and relabeled 14 individual Western blot images from an unrelated experiment conducted in September 2013 showing pull down. So these are interesting cases. They happen with frequency, and the University of Central Florida, unfortunately, has been engaged in this for quite some time. I will make a comment that when I first started doing research misconduct, oh my gosh, back in 1990, 1991, we had like 1 case per year at the most. Now we're running into 3, 4, and sometimes 5 cases per year. So what about plagiarism examples? Verbatim text taken from another author without quotation marks. Paraphrasing or summarizing others' work without providing proper credit. No or improper citation. Let me just make a comment about verbatim text taken from another author without quotation marks. You'd be surprised how often this happens. You'd also be surprised how often authors, I'm talking about either junior faculty, tenured faculty, postdocs, doctoral candidates doing their dissertation or contributing to a journal, where they paraphrase, they summarize someone else's work, and they provide no credit. They think that paraphrasing is okay. They think that providing information without quotation marks of someone else is okay. And when I give sessions to doctoral candidates and graduate students, I always make a comment to them is that what if that is your stuff and you're finding someone else is actually using your stuff and not giving you credit? And that's really what it boils down to is quotation marks. And I find it interesting that it's not just students, it's not postdocs only, it's not just doctoral candidates, it's faculty. And in many cases, it's tenured faculty. So I find it interesting. It's either, I guess I could use the term laziness, but it's also making sure that there's the faculty students who are writing this, either whether it be an introduction, summary, that they include everything. They include all citations. It's very important. So I have a comment down here of self-plagiarism. The reason I have is that in most cases, federal agencies don't identify self-plagiarism as something that they would want to take up and actually do a assessment, inquiry, or investigation. But from a puritist point of view, self-plagiarism is not good. It's unethical from a reading point of view. The reader, it's important that the reader know that if that information that's being textualized in a journal or in a proposal, if that's actually been done under a different study, if there actually was was published in a different publication type or in a previous year or years, the reader needs to understand that. So it's okay for you to put in your information, but you need to identify when you did it and under what context you did it. That's the key with self-plagiarism. So also other examples is citing later studies and not the original observation. In many cases, you'll get in journals where a secondary publication was quoted, but they don't cite the original observation, the original author. So it may be a secondary author, not of the original author, not of the original publication. And that's not right either, because again, that may be your information. It needs to be out there properly done. Also, relying on an abstract or a preliminary version of a paper while citing the published version. This can happen when you're doing conference papers. It does happen. It usually happens in the case of students. But normally there is advisors that are participating with the students, and they need to be aware of this type of activity happening. So there's also selective reporting of methodology, which is not inclusive of the entire methodology that needs to be reported. So also granting authorship to individuals who did not make significant contributions. Authorship is always an issue that comes up. It needs to be decided before the publication is put into print. And it is probably one of the biggest issues that comes up between relationships between students and advisors or faculty members.
Doug, before you move
go
on,
ahead. Yeah.
here are a couple of questions that relate to publication. I thought you might want to take those while you're there, if you're okay.
Sure.
Sandra asked, she says, I've been out of the writing field for some time now, but is there a software that runs publications papers to find instances of plagiarism?
Yeah, I would think the first one that comes to mind is one that most institutions use, which is called Authenticate. It's spelled with a small I and a capital T. And Authenticate software is not inexpensive, but we ask all of our graduate students and their advisors to use it. Well, it's very expensive if we were to use it for undergraduate. But Authenticate is an excellent software tool. There are others that are not as management oriented, but Authenticate would, from my mind, on an international basis, would be the best.
Thank you. And Greg Howell asks, when the source of the resource of the funding is totally non-federal and from a private foundation, are the rules for investigating research misconduct different?
The rules are the same, but the notification to the sponsor may be different. There may be proprietary data. There may be, there normally is not a requirement in the contracts and grants, the research contracts and grants, to reveal that data. But from a university point of view, identifying if the claims were accurate and if the respondent is guilty, it has to be done by the university. So the actual case is done properly. It's just that the notification to the private funding entity may be different compared to the federal. In most cases, if not all, the federal agencies have to be notified.
Okay. Adeline Estevez offers up that Turnitin and Authenticate are great resources.
Yeah, I would say that Turnitin more for an undergraduate, because what happens is that there's a repository that goes in Turnitin where everybody can see it. But the key and the advantage that I like about Authenticate is that I can put in a publication that one of my students did, and it does a comparison, but it doesn't let anybody know in the community what I'm comparing. I'm the one doing the comparison. So the repository is not based on that potentially plagiarized text. It just is doing the comparison and giving me the ability to review it and take action.
Okay. And then Nicole Thompson has made a comment. She said, I think students are often given egregious or intentional examples of plagiarism and move into their careers thinking that good intentions are enough or absolve the possibility of plagiarism. holding trainings explaining what plagiarism actually is sounds so helpful.
Yeah, I think that it's easy, and it's unfortunate, but for UCF and probably other institutions, we rely on city training, online training to do it. But I can tell you, and I think NIH agrees, obviously, because they require it on their training grants in many cases, to have face-to-face training. And it's important that they do understand it, especially from a laboratory perspective, and how things can be designed and conducted and shared with other people, and how that can be manipulated, either from a falsification, fabrication, or a plagiarism perspective. So to me, face-to-face is always more justifiable.
Okay, and then Srila Malik has a question here. Can researchers quote their own previous work without causing an issue?
Sure. I mean, I think as long as they cite what they've published. So if they, from a self-plagiarism point of view, if they've published something 5 years ago, something that they discovered in a journal, in a proposal, and if they do not cite that correctly, where they are properly explaining that they actually discovered it 5 years ago and the context behind it, that has a different meaning compared to if they announce it in a publication and they make you, the reader, come to the conclusion that you just discovered it. That's really the key with self-plagiarism, and that's why I guess I'll call it self-citation is important.
Okay. And Greg Howell again asked, what about the if the respondent is a faculty member versus staff or student? Are faculty given more protections? For example, in the Title IX investigations, sometimes faculty contracts make the standard a clear and convincing standard rather than preponderance of the evidence.
I mean, I have to go back to the preponderance of the evidence definition, more so than clear and apparent, because if you, from a preponderance of evidence perspective, what that means is that you're taking a look at all of the data. And again, I'll reemphasize proposals, journals, technical reports. You're looking at all of the facts, witnesses, etc. And that is the preponderance of evidence, but human beings have to come to a conclusion based on that evidence. And in some cases, it's going to be not just obvious, but plagiarism is going to be known and seen in black and white. There's going to be no question. Did they use the preponderance of evidence to come to that conclusion? Yes. There may be other cases outside of plagiarism, falsification, fabrication, that may be more complex, especially when it comes to photoshopping and parameters of that, just as an example. But I think that the preponderance of evidence from an administrative adjudication point of view, as outlined in NIH regulations, NSF regulations, I think that's reasonable.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for those questions. Those are good questions. To kind of continue on the plagiarism findings, there was an administrative law judge granted summary judgment in favor of ORI and issued the recommended decision finding that the respondent intentionally committed research misconduct by submitting to NIH a grant application that included plagiarized words. And the administrative law judge held that the appropriate administrative actions included a 2-year debarment from any contracting or subcontracting. The debarment has happened to certain faculty at the University of Central Florida. And it normally holds when they don't admit their wrongdoing, when the evidence is beyond a preponderance of proof. So another example is a former NSF program officer submitted an NSF proposal. This is interesting. With portions of text copied from a previously declined NSF proposal for which he had served as the cognizant PO. Wow. A PI plagiarized text in 4 NSF proposals and submitted falsified support letters from a collaborator with 2 of those proposals. So now we're talking about falsified support letters, not just falsification of research data. but these are things that, these are lessons learned that happen in this arena. So we got 15 minutes, and I wanted to go through an allegation that we had. I have to limit what I can say. I'll try to be as much as possible, but we had a case. It dealt with fabrication of nucleic acid analysis. And what it claimed was that there was a Photoshop of test tube results to detect the Zika virus. So the claimant provided 3 publications with examples of Photoshop test tubes. And they provided an exhibit of Photoshop manipulations from what they claimed was a forensic lab, claiming that the experiment test tube results were reorganized and color enhanced to produce the results. Now, before I get to the last bullet, what I want to let you know is that this process of taking a picture of test tube results where there's color, identifying the multiple test tubes and reorganizing them in order to correlate or reconcile with the publication proper. For example, each test tube result may involve different types of enzyme volume. And so in this example, you've got a faculty member who is doing the experiments, making pictures of test tubes, taking those test tube results and realigning them with the way in which it's being expressed in the journal. Like, for example, figure 1 are test tubes 1, 2, and 3 of XY enzymes. Figure 3 is test tubes 5, 6, and 7 of enzymes A, B, and C, in order to get across what their findings are. And what the claimant made was that this was all fabricated. But you can realize that you're looking at making actual pictures of test tubes. You're realigning that in a Photoshop so that the figures are accurate with what the actual publication is saying, and you can put it into the publication proper. So what my point is you're looking at different steps to get across in the journal, and a claimant can very easily say that it was Photoshopped, that the pictures were manipulated. And but they would have to prove what, how, why, or where, especially when you're also talking about color enhancement. And so when I was given this allegation from ORI, I had to do an assessment. And so that means I had to interview the respondent. I had to look at the data. I had to look at the publications. I had to actually ask for research data, actually find out how they made the pictures, how they re-identified those test tubes, on and on and on. And come to a conclusion and write back to ORI as to why I thought that the allegation was without merit. Now, I make a comment that the claimant did not address the chemical results published in the journals and did not address the allowable color enhancement parameters by the journal. So when I talk about the chemical results, I'm talking about the methods used and the actual statistical figures that came out under each figure. They did not do that. They just made an allegation about color enhancement and about manipulation of test tubes. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. So you can see, I know this may not be too clear, but you can see where there was actual statistical data validating this in the bars on the bottom. And you can also see the test tubes above. Now, in the publications, there was actually 3 publications that the person, the faculty member used. And the manipulation of the test tubes and the color enhancement was within the proper parameters. And you can tell that the color enhancement in the test tubes are not as important as the figure itself and what the statistical results are. That's really the key. Now, I'm only providing this one as an example, but I'll give you a general description of what the or show an image of what the claimant claimed. And this is an example of what they were saying. So they're showing me that they took a more forensic review of the picture, and they came to the conclusion, as an example, it says what is the flying square? I will name the arrow Z, and we'll explain to you what it indicates. And you can see there that this is figure 1A with highlighted photoshopping evidence. Well, I don't know about you personally, but when I took a look at this, I have a blurred vision of color enhancement that was done by Photoshop that is not out of line, but I also have to tell you that I can't really determine what the claimant is making a claim on. For example, the fourth test tube from the left is showing a articulated lines. Does that mean that it's two test tubes? What is the source of the information? What is the source of the color enhancement, which cannot be described? I can't accuse someone of fabricating data without proper backup documentation. And I will make a comment that when I did request the information from ORI to give me the forensic lab results, they could not be produced. So this is an example of where data was created to, I get the lack of a better term, is to harm a faculty member without proper evidence. And from a preponderance of the evidence, I came to this conclusion, or I accepted my assessment. The assessment was probably about 7 pages with backup documentation like I'm showing you here. But at the end of the day, it's very time consuming. And, if you're going to make a claim, it needs to be factual. It needs to be proper. I'll put it that way. But this is an example of what we've run up against. Before I go to the next case, Jennifer, are there any more questions?
Sorry, it took me a minute to get my microphone on. Are there many investigations into double dipping? In other words, or for example, charging 2 different grants on investigations, 2 different grants an investigator may have for the same cost? So this is more of a general question.
Yeah, I guess the best way to answer that is yes. What you'll find is that, as you know, many faculty will create multiple proposals, and in many cases, the research data that they have to prove and show why they should be funded may have data in it that has either been fabricated, falsified, or plagiarized. And for example, there could be a proposal that goes out with the design of 4 tasks in the NSF, and those same tasks, they may be in different order, but they may have sent it to the Department of Defense. And what you'll find is that the National Science Foundation will work with both, in my example, DoD and themselves, to identify where the same faculty member has manipulated documents and data in 2 separate proposals. So if I'm answering the question right, the answer would be yes, it happens.
Thank you. Elaine, did that answer your question? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Doug.
You're welcome. So in another case we had, this is an interesting case. It was about research methods and ethics. We had human subject participants were recruited to give blood samples for a physiological exercise results study. They would do physical activity, they would take the blood, and they would look at the blood characteristics to make a determination. And one of the research team inadvertently drew blood from a subject without inserting an unused needle. And that's very serious. Things could happen, and it's obvious as to why. Now, the allegation claimed that the PI did not report the incident to IRB officials as required under the protocol. And blood that was drawn, the documents and related statistics went missing, and the research team, in many cases, went silent on the event. So let me go here to the next one. So the PI claimed it was a minor incident and was not reportable. I'll make a comment that the following day, the actual recipient of the needle, the incorrect needle, unclean needle, I'll call it, happened to be a part of the research team. That's a different topic, an IRB topic that would need to be brought up from a compliance point of view. So here we are waiting a full day to let the actual person that had the problem learn about the incident, which they were not happy about by any means. But they were all part of a research team and they were very protective of each other. So the claimant reported the subject was not notified over this 24-hour period and preventing meaningful detection or therapy of any tainted blood. So, I'll just bring up to you, what are my ethical requirements in this case? Is this falsification, fabrication, plagiarism? Or is this more in the area of ethics, of not following proper scientific procedures and protocol? Is this research misconduct? And if you have a policy that addresses the traditional research misconduct, but doesn't address these other ethical issues that take place, that was data not included? Is that called you're fabricating data that doesn't include all of what happened? Could it be that this person's record was completely removed, so it didn't misalign the data at all, and it wouldn't come up in any type of a investigation or inquiry or assessment? So, that's why I say, is the removal of data related to falsification? Again, what are the ethical requirements for a research integrity officer in this case? And quite frankly, how should the university assess and carry out the case in light of the fact that the research misconduct definitions were not directly infracted? I mean, it wasn't plagiarism directly. It was very difficult without getting the backup documentation to prove that the information on this one subject, and believe me, there was absolutely hundreds of subjects that were reviewed, to find the information on this one and to make a determination whether or not that information was falsified. It was manipulated, it was changed. So these are some of the types of the issues that come up in my office. I don't know about others, but if you have any comments, I'm open to them. That's really all, Jennifer, that I had for today. But I'm open to any other questions you may have.
Are there other questions or comments? Besides relying on people to make complaints to your office, are there other things your office does to root out misconduct?
That's an excellent question. I think the best thing, this may sound pretty general, but the best thing is that I've learned over the years is that faculty really take the time, especially on training grants and undergraduates and graduates, but that they really take the time to go over this topic. Don't just rely on the online training, but really do face-to-face, because there's more involved with it in the engagement of data and sharing of data between people, of what constitutes taking the time to make sure that things are cited properly, making sure that the creation of data and the way it's documented is not, and falsified sounds so egregious and fabricated sounds so egregious, but when you look at how data is created and how it's stored and how it's shared, it may not be that difficult to see how someone may inadvertently do that. So it's important that when you do the training, the actual design of the research and the conduct of the research, that the advisors and the faculty members take the time to train people. That's the best that I can say.
Well, I have one other request. Would you stop sharing your screen and turn the camera on for just a minute and wave at everybody?
Yeah, I will. Let me see if I can. So
there you go.
there you go.
Right.
See ya.
So thank you so much, Doug. I saved your session for the last session because I know that after a long week of everybody trying to keep the ship moving forward at home as well as attending sessions, that we needed a really good one for that last session, and this has been a really good one. I always love hearing case studies on research integrity and breaches of research integrity, because I'm fascinated to hear about what people will do and think that it's okay, and what we have to do to protect it. Because when any one of these things shows up in the newspaper, it sort of paints us all with the same brush. So I think that it takes a community to ensure that research integrity is actually in place the way that it should be. And thank you so much for everything that you do for research integrity, not just here at UCF, but through working with FDP as well. So
Thank you, Jennifer. Your very, very kind words. I appreciate it. And I appreciate everybody's time today.
okay. All right. Thank you so much.
See ya.